Summer is my favorite time of the year to be throwing topwaters to get big blowups from redfish, speckled trout, and even snook if you have them in your area. As the water temperatures rise with the heat of summer, most of these fish are getting really active because their metabolism kicks into overdrive, and one of the best baits to be throwing to get them to commit to really smashing something is a big topwater presentation. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about the best way to fish these topwater lures, some spots that are productive for each of the species that I've mentioned, and even go into some deeper dives of which colors you're going to want to use, the best tactics for topwaters, and everything you need to know to get out there and get some awesome blowups from fish this summer. Now, topwaters do have a great range of drawing fish in, but they're not going to be drawing in fish from miles away, so we need to make sure that we're putting them in the right general spots. And I want to cover two different types of estuaries that most people are going to be throwing topwaters in, and that's those coastal marsh environments and those coastal grass flat environments. And I'm going to go ahead and dive into the grass flats first. Typically, where we're going to see the redfish zones is a little bit closer to the mangroves and a little bit closer to those shorelines. If you can combine some of these mangrove lines or some of these shallow grass flat areas with oyster bar points, mangrove points, things of this nature where it's generally going to be about 1 to 3 feet in depth, we're going to see a lot of redfish in these areas at twilight periods that are very aggressively feeding, and typically that's where I get my best redfish bites on topwater. Now, if you're after those trout, you need to move a little bit deeper out. Typically, they're not hunting as shallow as redfish, so I'm looking for those zones that are about 3 to 5 feet in depth. And yes, trout are typically fixed on the surface of the water, so you can be fishing a little bit deeper, and don't worry, they will come up to hit that topwater, especially some of those larger ones that are really aggressively looking for some of those bigger bait fish presentations. Now, typically in these grass flat areas, you will have the possibility of getting onto some snook as well, and they're typically going to be tight to those mangroves. Usually the snook zones fall within the redfish zones as well, and don't be surprised if you catch a redfish on one cast and a snook on the next. In fact, the last time I fished with Luke, we both doubled up on a redfish and a snook at the same time in the exact same spot. Now, to look quickly at the marsh system environments, what I'm usually going to be looking for is points, especially points with oyster bars that are close to large marsh mazes. The reason for this is as bait is moved out of these smaller marsh mazes that predators don't typically want to go searching up in, they stack up in areas where there's going to be a high flow of bait on both incoming and outgoing tides. Now, as I covered in the grass flat areas, typically you're going to see redfish hanging a little bit shallower, close to those oyster bars in those areas that are about 1 to 3 feet in depth. And usually you're going to be hanging right off those muddy banks where you're seeing, again, a lot of oysters. Those were always my favorite areas to throw topwaters at when I lived in the Carolinas, were right over those oyster bars. Or if you are fishing on an open marsh flat where you've got kind of some spread out grass that is, again, connected to some of these marsh mazes, a lot of times you'll see right at the entrances to where those mazes kind of begin on the open flats, those redfish will be tailing at the beginning of incoming tides, and you can usually, again, get them to feed really aggressively in that 1 to 3 foot depth range. Now, as far as trout go, typically they're going to be situated on the outside of these marsh mazes, usually kind of close to those intercoastal channels. I typically don't find a lot of trout right up in the marsh, but if you can find some deeper creeks that are connected to those marsh systems, you usually are going to be able to find those trout hanging in about 4 to 5 feet of depth. Usually that's the best bite that I find in terms of topwater and marsh systems, but I have had trout come up from a little bit deeper, but I don't typically find them much shallower than 4 feet. Now let's go ahead and talk about your retrieve, because it's really important that you work these topwaters right, and the biggest thing to remember is the cadence. So to demonstrate this retrieve here, I'm fishing at the deeper edge of a grass flat for some trout, and all you do to walk the dog is just create slack by bouncing that rod tip in the opposite direction that your lure is. So the lure's over to my right, I'm bouncing the rod tip to the left, and I'm gonna pick up that slack. I'm not actually reeling in the lure, just picking up the slack, and you can see the fish hopped right on top of it. Very easy to walk the dog, and you'll find that speeding up the retrieve or slowing down the walk is usually what's gonna trigger those fish to strike. Now, a big mistake I see from folks when they go buy their topwaters is they get really confused by all the different patterns and colors that are out there. And I can tell you guys, it's very unlikely that fish will ever see any crazy patterns that are on the very back of your lure. At most, they'll see something that's closer to the tail or along the bottom of the lure. So it's very easy to just choose a light and a dark lure. If you want to just go with one color that works in pretty much any scenario, go with the bone. That white reflects the water that is around it. It creates great contrast if you're fishing in just moderate clarity to very clear water, and it does a great job under a variety of scenarios. Typically, the most natural presentation you can give is a white lure, so this bone does a great job of creating a little bit of contrast on the surface that fish can easily zero in on. Now, if you're fishing extremely dirty water, that really dark brown water, I do find that using a darker lure, or if you're fishing on a day that you've got really heavy overcast clouds, You need to create a little bit more contrast than is available with the bone. This darker lure will work really well. I'm not sold on just the chartreuse head. I've used darker topwaters that just have the dark back, dark sides, things like that. Just again, the dark nature of the lure that creates a little bit more contrast. There's no specific color that you need to zero in on. Something that's dark purple, just jet black, things like that, that helps create good contrast that those fish can zero in on. So don't get too caught up in all the different colors or patterns that are out there. Really just a dark and a light lure is all you need. Now, I'd also like to give you guys 3 really good options for topwater lures for summer fishing. The first is going to be this Rapala skitter walk. This is a really good option first thing in the morning, right before that sun comes up, when it's really low light conditions, because the strength of this lure doesn't actually fall into where the predators can see where it walks, because the other two are a little bit better in terms of the actual walk the dog action. But this big fat cigar style body and the really low frequency rattle that's in this lure does a great job of bringing fish up to the surface in the dark. It does a great job of imitating a big shad or a big mullet. So I really like this in the really low light conditions. You can see I've got a low light color scheme on here. I don't tend to use this once the sun comes up, because I find that predators are going to key in on the walk more of your lure, and that's where I'm going to start using one of these spook style imitations. First, you've got the Super Spook Junior, which is the OG topwater out there. Really nice torpedo design, allows for accurate casting, slightly less distance than the skitter walk because of number one, the weight of the rattle and the tapering of the nose, which is going to allow for a slightly longer glide on the skitter walk. But again, very accurate caster, and in terms of how easy it is to walk this lure and get a good wide cut out of it, the Super Spook is one of the best ones out there. So it's very easy lure to use, very accurate caster. It's really good for those who are just starting out with topwaters. But we just designed this Salt Strong Moonwalker to be a good balance between these two. And not to mention, it also comes with single inline hooks right out of the package. As you guys can see, I've changed out my single inlines on the skitter walk, and I still have the stock trebles on the Super Spooks. But to talk about kind of the differences of the Moonwalker versus the Super Spook and skitter walk, you can see we've got all of the pros of each of these lures. The tapered nose to allow for a little bit better distance casting. It does have the torpedo style body of the Super Spook, slightly larger rattle, so it does have the nice weight and the frequency of the rattle of the skitter walk, while still getting the really good wide cuts of the Super Spook. In fact, it has a slightly tapered nose that's going to allow for a little bit wider of a cut. So just as easy to walk with as the Super Spook. It's going to work in low light conditions and when the sun comes up as well. I've been using this a lot for redfish and trout, and it's just worked phenomenally. In fact, threw it right into a school of mullet when I was going after some redfish. Out of all of those mullet those redfish could have chosen, they went after the Moonwalker. Really great option here. And again, these single inlines are about 50 cents a piece, and I do find that these make a huge difference in fishing and weeding out a lot of the smaller fish, but also not losing my fish. In fact, I've lost a lot of fish on trebles when I go to set the hook. You're having to put all of that power into 6 different hook points versus 2, and a lot of times with trout, with their really soft mouths, that can make a difference when they come up and shake their heads. I lose a lot less fish on single inlines, and the fact that these come straight out of the box with those single inlines just is really great for me, and I do enjoy that we've added that feature on there. So I highly recommend you guys pick up all 3 of these topwaters. They're really great options, and if you do choose one of these 2, I highly recommend you change out those trebles to single inlines. And I'd like to hear from you guys what your favorite topwaters are for summer fishing. There's a lot of different brands out there, Mirror Lure, Yozuri, that I didn't even mention in these top 3, but I'd like to hear from you guys about what your favorite topwaters are for summer fishing, so please leave those in the comment section below. So if you're new to Salt Strong, just know that we're the best online fishing club in America, because we literally guarantee that you'll be catching more fish in less time while saving money on your tackle. We do this by providing you with premium education, an exclusive online fishing community, and access to group discounts on the best saltwater fishing tackle. To learn more, go to saltstrong.com. We hope to see you in the Insider Club family soon.